Kitco Mining special coverage of PDAC 2024 is brought to you by Gold Mining, Uranium Energy Corp, and Uranium Royalty Corp.
Decarbonisation challenges get real. This is Paul Harris for Kitco Mining at the 2024 Prospectors and Developers Association Conference in Toronto, Canada. And joining me today to discuss this is Mark Fellows, co-founder and CEO of Skarn Associates. Mark, welcome back to Kitco.
Thank you so much, Paul.
You hosted a fascinating seminar this morning in which you spoke about the efforts to decarbonise the mining sector and the fact that the sector faces mounting challenges as many of the easy gains have been achieved. What has the mining sector done so far in terms of its Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions?
The low-hanging fruit in terms of decarbonisation has been Scope 2 emissions. So that's the emissions that arise from purchased energy and effectively electricity supplied from the grid in most cases. And where miners can access renewable power purchase agreements, they are, many of them, taking advantage of that or putting in place the plan to do so. And so we've seen that already make some fairly significant impacts on the carbon emissions from, say, the copper miners in Chile. And obviously that's been facilitated by the arrival of low carbon electricity as a supply into the Chilean grid. So it really does depend on where you're located and what the power generation situation is there. And where that isn't an option in countries such as, say, South Africa, where there's obviously some long-term issues there with regard to getting Eskom to deliver enough power, let alone swap out its existing coal-fired power generation capacity for something less carbon intensive. That's not an option. And in the case of the South African miners, they've been double hamstrung by the difficulty in getting renewable capacity on mine site permitted. So, but Scope 2 is very much the easiest part of your emissions to start making some kind of inroads on. And obviously, if you then are able to electrify more of your operation and find ways to swap out your diesel mobile equipment for something electrified, then that low carbon electricity supply allows you to reduce your Scope 1 emissions as well. So that is the way that the story is unfolding right now. And the Scope 1 is going to be inherently more difficult because it's dependent on technologies that are still as yet being developed and in the very early stages of commercialization. So that the real benefits of Scope 1 reduction are going to be some way down the line yet.
Okay. You put up some very interesting charts. You said that in the period 2018 to 2022, mining companies in general made some good advances related to Scope 2. But you said the sector is set to miss its net zero trajectory. Many miners have a net zero target of 2040, 2050. You said they're set to miss because their efforts to decarbonise and reduce their greenhouse gas intensity is going now at a slower rate than that required to hit the 3.6% year reduction estimated as necessary to remain within the 1.5 degree climate warming pathway established by the Paris Climate Agreement. Why is this?
There's a number of reasons, but if you look at emissions for the mines producing a particular commodity, one way of looking at those emissions and benchmarking them is to look at it on an intensity basis. So how many tons of CO2 or CO2 equivalent gases are being emitted per ton of metal produced. So if you look at, say, copper or nickel, and the industry averages in terms of that GHG intensity, they're not moving downwards as rapidly as they would need to be hitting that 1.5 degrees temperature rise pathway. So you'd effectively need to be achieving a roughly 3.6% year-on-year intensity reduction to be achieving that 1.5 degree pathway. And over the past couple of years, it's been less than that. One of the other factors that impacts here is that particularly with commodities like nickel, or even more so in the case of lithium, there are some really substantial increases in production happening. And where those additional mines are higher intensity emitters, so at the higher end of the carbon intensity curve, they're effectively adding additional CO2 tonnage in pure tonnage terms, not in intensity terms. So there's a sort of inherent tension between production growth at too higher carbon intensity. So there's a double pressure there. We're trying to increase production, but we want it to be low carbon production. And in the case of nickel, the production growth has, over the last couple of years, been very strong from Indonesia, where Chinese companies have financed a whole load of pyrometallurgical ferronickel production capacity, all of it powered by coal-fired power stations, and the process itself using coal as a reductant. So there's a direct CO2 emission from that within the actual smelting process. And so all of that new capacity coming online in Indonesia has effectively pushed the curve upwards. It's much higher carbon intensity than, say, a sulphide nickel producer in Canada, where you have hydroelectricity, which is almost zero carbon, and the sulphide nickel production process is itself less energy intensive because you derive some energy from the sulphide component of the concentrate when you put it into the smelter. Nickel laterites in Indonesia, they're incredibly energy intensive, effectively refractory material that you've got to blast with a whole load of energy and a whole load of coal as a reductant. So you're looking at a differential in emissions intensity of 5 to 10 to 20 times between a sulphide producer in Canada and a laterite producer in Indonesia. So it's what kind of growth is happening. And again, there's a similar situation, although not quite so extreme in lithium, where much of the growth in lithium supply is coming from hard rock lithium rather than brines. That hard rock has to be shipped as a concentrate to very often China, and there's an energy-intensive, carbon-intensive process to get it to that battery-ready lithium carbonate equivalent. So again, there's growth occurring in lithium, but it's weighted towards the high carbon end of the curve. And this is the dilemma that we face in decarbonising not just our sector, but many other activities, economic activities. There's a real danger that we'll actually contribute to the problem rather than improve the situation. It's fine to build an electric vehicle, but if the nickel or the graphite or the cobalt that's going into that battery is sourced from inherently high carbon operations, it's you've got a high embodied carbon in that battery, and it's not really a net gain.
I think you mentioned this morning, or the phrase you used is the cure is worse than the disease.
Yeah.
Okay.
Could be.
Let's get in some other aspects you mentioned this morning. But before I do so, earlier this week here at the PDAC, Rio Tinto Chief Executive Jakob Stralsholm said during his keynote that the capital markets are not rewarding low carbon initiatives, low carbon operations. The question there is who's going to pay for it. And you put up a couple of interesting slides this morning, giving the example of a copper mine. So looking at it from a financial optimization point of view, they can abate 15% of their emissions through to 2040 using technologies that can deliver a positive return on investment. Looking at it just from a pure abatement perspective, up to more than 50%. So it seems that the sector has the ability to go a lot further, but as Jakob said, who's going to pay for it?
And that's a very valid point. Right now, the economics of decarbonisation don't carry the argument. It really does not make. It's not a slam dunk from an economic point of view. That will change over time as the decarbonised technologies start to get scale and economies of scale. But right now, we're still in the early stages of technologies like battery electric, hydrogen fuel cell, haul trucks being commissioned, built out, proven up. And we're nowhere near yet those technologies being rolled out at scale. And it's a classic dilemma when are you willing to be an early adopter and take the economic penalty for that because you may have other motives. So in the case of the major diversified mining companies, the pressure on them to be seen to be decarbonising is arguably sufficient for them to take the economic hit to be seen to be doing the right thing. It's less attractive, less viable if you're a smaller or mid-tier producer. You're more capital constrained, you're probably a bit less under the spotlight from your investors to decarbonise. So I think there's a lot of tendency below the majors to essentially wait and see how the technologies develop and what the costs of them are in a few years' time. But obviously that does contribute to the delay in decarbonising. And this is a really difficult dilemma. Without massive subsidy, it's going to be difficult to resolve quickly, and technology takes time.
Well, let's go back to nickel. You mentioned how Indonesia's brought a lot of capacity on stream and it's been low cost, and it's putting some of the nickel sulphide out of business. The nickel sulphide, by and large, is a lot cleaner, but it's being sort of priced out by the dirtier nickel laterite. And diversified miners, their response is, we're going to shutter our production because there's no premium there. Despite it's clean, it seems the market doesn't care.
Yeah. Absolutely right. That's the situation, and I'm sure the major diversifieds would love to establish a premium for green nickel, but the market has to go along with that. And as we know, the nickel market is in many respects already dysfunctional, already volatile, and it remains the case that low cost production wins out regardless of the carbon footprint.
It's a pure commodity.
Yeah. Where that could well change is now that we have higher carbon taxes coming in, we have mechanisms such as the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, coming into play, and that will affect nickel in the not too distant future. It's potentially going to ratchet up the pressure. It could well mean that nickel sourced from those high carbon operations is going to be limited in its market, and it's going to be paying high tariffs to enter, for instance, the EU. So ultimately the international trade economics will have a huge effect. But it's some way off yet, I think, before that really starts to be felt.
The analysis you presented this morning, Mark, is the first time I've seen sort of data presented in that way. So far, I think it'd be fair to say that the critical minerals debate has been about, governments have to facilitate things, otherwise the material's not going to be available. But it now seems the adjunct to that is, unless you provide subsidies or other kinds of assistance, we're not going to be able to hit the decarbonisation goals that you as governments or society at large are setting us. So do you see the possibility of your analysis being used as part of the lobbying effort to government to say, look, if you want to deliver on Paris climate goals, you need to help?
Yeah, and I think if you, it's been a very interesting journey over the last few years to see how engaged governments have become over the critical minerals issue. And it's quite extraordinary the extent to which governments are now taking an interest in that. But I think we have to bear in mind that doesn't necessarily mean that they really understand the full context. And I think there's still probably a huge learning curve for governments to go go through to actually understand that simply onshoring your supply chains or introducing some kind of tariff barrier is not necessarily going to get the effect that you want. And I think it's quite interesting to look at the interestingly named Inflation Reduction Act in the US and the extent to which that has acted as a real kind of shot in the arm to the economy, and obviously has a very strong connection with decarbonisation across sectors. And maybe there's a template there. Maybe what we actually do need is for more governments globally to actually take an active role in incentivising the right kind of industries and technologies locally in order to meet what are ultimately national goals. I mean, governments have huge amount, skin in the game here, and maybe they'll realise that although in a market-driven economy, it's not always politically palatable to be offering subsidies or some kind of market support, but maybe there's a good argument for it in some cases.
Okay. One thing we haven't talked about so far is Scope 3 emissions, and that seems to be the next hurdle that the sector is going to be wrestling with. Why are tackling Scope 3 emissions so challenging?
They're challenging in lots of regards. They're challenging not only in terms of reducing them, they're challenging with regard to actually quantifying them. And the interesting kind of marker here is the work that was put out in September last year by the ICMM. They put out a document which set the guidelines for reporting Scope 3 emissions after, I think, quite lengthy conversations between the ICMM members as to how it was feasible for them to deal with this issue. And the outcome is a set of reporting guidelines which allow quite significant latitude for the mining companies to adopt Scope 3 quantification methodologies to suit their particular circumstances. And I think that must have been quite a difficult thing to square off amongst the members, because in many cases the members may be sourcing their inputs, their raw material, their supplies from producers who may not be able to give them very good estimates with regard to the amount of carbon that was emitted in producing them. And this is what Scope 3 is about. It's your upstream carbon embodied in the inputs that go into your operation. And it's not very easy to get that information. It could be that you're sourcing your grinding media from a steel manufacturer in China, and it would be quite likely that they are unable to provide you with good numbers in terms of how much carbon was emitted. You could be dealing with a large number of small suppliers, and you have to make decisions on whether the emissions in the products they're giving you are actually significant enough to warrant reporting. So there's various options provided to the ICMM members in terms of how they report their Scope 3, and some of those are likely to be more accurate than others. And I think that's challenge number one. Challenge number two is actually helping your suppliers or your end users. So in the case of, say, the iron ore producers shipping iron ore to the steel producers, how are you going to facilitate their reduction in CO2 emissions? Which is why we see so many initiatives between the major iron ore producers and the steel producers to develop DRI technologies or using hydrogen as a reductant, all of these things. The miners have a huge interest in being able to show reduction in their own Scope 3.
And they give some dimension to that, Mark. You had some charts, and particularly for many metals, particularly for things like iron ore, scope, when you put them all on the continuum, scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, you can barely see them. It's all, the scope 3 is just huge.
It's huge. If you're an iron ore producer, it's massive. If you're a gold miner flying doré to a refinery somewhere, it's minimal. You know, your at least your downstream scope 3. Your upstream scope 3 is still pretty substantial. And in those cases, upstream scope 3 for a lot of miners is it's actually associated with the hydrocarbon fuel production. So besides the emission, scope 1 emission from burning that fuel at the mine site, there's a big emission associated with actually extracting, refining, shipping that diesel, whatever it is.
Getting it there in the first place.
Getting it there in the first place. And so that's, but there's kind of if you like, there's a synergy there. If you can swap out your diesel haul fleet, you're not only going to be reducing your scope 1 emission, you're going to be reducing your upstream scope 3 as well. So I think that one will very much come as a follow-on from reducing the hydrocarbon use.
Bringing things to a close, Mark, what are you looking forward to this year in the decarbonisation space?
Gosh, that's a good question. What I'm looking forward to is more companies giving us more detail on how they're going to achieve their 2030 targets. And we're starting to see, and 2050 targets as well for that matter, we're starting to see some of the majors putting out really interesting insight into how they plan to hit those targets. And in the case of many of the smaller companies and many of the majors, we're not seeing that detail yet. That will be really interesting because they're in a difficult position in that they need to make some leaps of faith with regard to what the economics of some of these technologies will be, let alone identifying which of the technologies are actually going to be useful to them. And all of them, in reality, are going to be left with a rump of emissions that is going to be very hard to decarbonise. So in those cases, we are going to see a certain amount of offsetting included in the decarbonisation plan. But I'm just looking forward to seeing more of these coming out because it's fascinating. It gives a lot of insight into the whole supply chain. You know, what are the equipment manufacturers going to have to do? What are we going to have to do in terms of reconfiguring the mining, the processing, the downstream, the whole thing? So it's going to be effectively a redesign of our industry from bottom up, and it's coming.
Okay, a fascinating conversation, Mark, and a very important one. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Paul.
And this is Paul Harris for Kitco Mining at the 2024 PDAC in Toronto, Canada. If you like what you see, don't forget to subscribe.
Kitco Mining special coverage of PDAC 2024 is brought to you by Gold Mining, Uranium Energy Corp, and Uranium Royalty Corp.